How long does it take for the corruption of death to reach its maturity? How long does it take for the coursing currents of hell to burrow down to the very core of the hearts of well intentioned men? Well, I guess that's the question that the second half of our story here is going to address in a way here in Genesis chapter 4, the second half of the fall story, or we could say the Adam and Eve and the fall story. So, chapter 4, part of the reason that we can think of it as a continuation of the Adam and Eve story, there's a lot of reasons, but part of it is because it kind of begins and ends with Adam and Eve. So it starts off with Adam and Eve and the birth of Cain. In verse 1 there, Adam knew his wife Eve intimately, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, etc. So it starts off with Adam and Eve giving birth to Cain, then it goes on to the story and life of Cain, and then it gives you the descendants of Cain, culminating with Lamech as the sixth generation from Cain. And then we go back to Adam and Eve with the Adam and Eve and the birth of Seth. And then that's followed up by the descendants of Seth, or the descendants of Adam and Eve through Seth in chapter 5. So that's really the structure there. Adam and Eve and the birth of Cain, the story and life of Cain, descendants of Cain, Adam and Eve and the birth of Seth, and then descendants of Adam and Eve through Seth. So we could say that the Cain story is kind of a section within the Adam and Eve and the fall story of Genesis 3 through 4. The Cain story is, you could say, an expansion of the consequences of the fall, culminating in Lamech as the sixth descendant of Cain, and really as the blossoming of Cain's vice. And you could also think of the Cain story as the first development of Genesis 3:15. Genesis 3:15 is part of the curse that God pronounces. It's the part where God says, I will put hostility between you and the woman, and between your seed, the serpent's seed, and her seed. He will strike your head, and you will strike his heel. So often thought of as a messianic type of thing. So we could think of the Cain story as the first development of 3:15, with Cain being one option, one possible option. From the retro point of view, it could have been thought of as one possible option for the seed, capital S. Of course, it didn't turn out that way. You could say Abel maybe was the other option for the seed, because in 4:25, it's when Seth is born, she says, God has given me another child in the place of Abel, suggesting that Abel was really the one who should have been the source of hope. Of course, Abel didn't work out either, because Abel got killed. And then the third would be Seth, which is where chapter 4 ends. And you could think of that as the end of the Adam and Eve and the fall story. Of course, chapter 5, the descendants of Adam and Eve, that's kind of like in parallel with, we just had the descendants of Cain. So we could think of the whole story going there. And then that genealogy ends with Noah. So it kind of goes straight into the Noah story. But anyway, we could think of the Cain story as being a development of that, the seed kind of thing, with this is the first seed and the second, the Abel was kind of mixed in there. And then kind of the story then, if we thought of it as ending there at the end of chapter 4, then it kind of ends on an open-ended note, because this other possible way of thinking of the seed, Seth, like, okay, well, here we are now. What's next? So let's take a look at this. Let's take a look at chapter 4 here, which really we're coming in halfway. We just finished where Adam and Eve just got kicked out of the garden, and they look back, and there's the cherubim with the flaming, whirling sword to guard the way to the tree of life. And then we get chapter 4, verse 1. Adam knew his wife intimately, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain. She said, I have had a male child with the Lord's help. Or as the old King James puts it, I have gotten a man from the Lord. I like that way of putting it. Verse 2, then she also gave birth to his brother Abel. Now Abel became a shepherd of a flock, but Cain cultivated the land. In the course of time, Cain presented some of the land's produce as an offering to the Lord. And Abel also presented an offering, some of the firstborn of his flock in their fat portions. The Lord had regard for Abel and his offering, but he did not have regard for Cain and his offering. Cain was furious, and he was downcast. Then the Lord said to Cain, why are you furious? Why are you downcast? If you do right, or you could say if you do good, if you do well, If you do right, won't you be accepted? But if you do not do right, sin is crouching at the door. Its desire is for you, but you must master it. Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's guardian?" Then he said, "What have you done? Your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." You know what's interesting? In Genesis 1 through 2, one of the things, as I've been going through each of these videos talking about different parts of Genesis 1 through 2, one of the things that I've noticed is how everything about the gradual, progressive creation process is the unfolding of one more good thing after another. In Genesis 1 through 2, the incomplete or the work in progress good is good. It is just good, good and beautiful. It is the thing from God for us to admire and be in awe of. I think that's a big part of what these are supposed to be about. It's about this is the greatness of the true God doing what the true God does, one piece on top of another. Particularly in Genesis 2, this is the unfolding of more good, God's design getting better, more complete, more full. So in Genesis 1 through 2, the incomplete or the work in progress good is just good and beautiful. But in Genesis 4, after that all happened, in Genesis 3, now in Genesis 4, the good of God's approval that he showed to Abel, the good of God's approval is perceived as offensive. To Cain, the good from God is a bad thing. Now, even the good things that remain of God's work and of God's nature, the good things that remain are defiled by the dark, wicked cravings that have become normal, that are embedded in the human race. So, when God says to Cain, "Why are you furious? If you do well, you do good, you'll be accepted. If you don't, Cain, sin is crouching at your door. It wants you. You have to master it." But Cain wasn't interested in mastering it. There were other things he was interested in, and we go straight into that. Let's go out into the field. That's what he wants to master. It's not himself. He wants to master somebody else. And then in verse 9, Cain, where's your brother? I don't know. Am I his guardian? You know, it's interesting. Where did he get the idea of this category of a guardian? You know, obviously, Adam and Eve and their descendants had language kind of built in as a gift from God, prepackaged. But what in the heck would guardian have meant to somebody in this primeval, primitive culture that God made? I wonder the precedent for this category of guardian in a world where there's nothing you need to be guarded from yet. Perhaps the precedent for this guardian category, when he says, "Am I a guardian?" ironically, sarcastically, I wonder if the precedent for that might have been in the first half of the Adam and Eve and fall story. There was a guardian that showed up in chapter 3, verse 24, when God is concerned that Adam and Eve might take from the tree of life. So he sends them out. And in verse 24 of chapter 3, it says, God drove man out, and east of the Garden of Eden, he stationed cherubim with a flaming, whirling sword to guard the way to the tree of life. Once defilement has come into the world, guarding things becomes a category. It becomes something that exists because the world's a different place. So maybe the precedent for the guardian category was the military cherub in 324. And maybe Cain is basically saying, what, God? Must I guard the sacred blood the way the cherub guards the sacred tree? Is that what you're expecting of me? But the fact of the matter is, when chaos and sin crawl over the air, the sacred can no longer stand unguarded, whether that's the sacred tree or the sacred blood. Because this is the part where inner and outer peace have both gone away. But the thing is, the sacred will not become silent. Just like the fruit of the tree that was eaten, just like the fruit of the tree continues to bleed through all ages, even so, here in chapter 4, the sacred blood of the seed of Adam goes on crying out up through the Adamah, the soil, to God. Keeps on crying out to God because the sacred can't be silenced. Its voice rings out through silent messengers that scream. So, what have you done? Your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. So now you are cursed with alienation from the ground that opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood that you have shed. If you work the land, it will never again give you its yield. You will be a restless wanderer on the earth. But Cain answered the Lord, my punishment is too great to bear, since you are banishing me today from the soil, and I must hide myself from your presence and become a restless wanderer on the earth. Whoever finds me will kill me. Then the Lord replied to him, in that case, whoever kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over. And he placed a mark on Cain, so that whoever found him would not kill him. Then Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And then the Cain story finishes with his epilogue. It finishes with 6 generations culminating in Lamech. So, verse 17, Cain knew his wife intimately, and she conceived and gave birth to Enoch. And that's phrased the same way as the beginning of this chapter, the beginning of the Adam and Eve and Cain portion of the story. And then now we go on to the descendants of Cain section. Then Cain became the builder of a city, and he named the city Enoch after his son. Irad was born to Enoch. Irad fathered Mehujael. Mehujael fathered Methushael. Methushael fathered Lamech. Lamech took 2 wives for himself, one named Ada, the other named Zillah. Ada bore Jabal. He was the father of the nomadic herdsmen. His brother was named Jubal. He was the father of all who play the lyre and the flute. Zillah bore Tubal-Cain, who made all kinds of bronze and iron tools. Tubal-Cain's sister was Naamah. And then after giving us the immediate descendants of Lamech, then they tell us a little bit about Lamech. Lamech said to his wives, Ada and Zillah, hear my voice. Wives of Lamech, pay attention to my words. For I killed a man for wounding me, a boy for striking me. If Cain is to be avenged 7 times over, then for Lamech it would be 77 times. In a way, we could say the Lamech story continues the Cain story as the development of the fall inclinations. Because in Cain, blood was shed due to lack of control, due to impulse. Generations later, 6 generations later, in Lamech, blood is shed due to premeditated and self-normalizing, kind of culturalized decision. Lamech brags because he values his murder as a way to establish what he had, to establish an agreeable culture that he likes. So then we could say Cain and Lamech together are organic follow-ups to Genesis 3, which is why they all kind of tie together. It's almost like he's basically saying, when he says if Cain is to be avenged 7 times over, he's got this mark on him, so God's going to kind of protect him. Well, if Cain is avenged 7 times, for Lamech, it'll be 77 times. It's almost like he's saying, hey, maybe God watches out for Cain, but this God watches out for me. And this little bit here is in poetry. A lot of the parts of these early chapters here are little bits of poetry, which in certain translations it'll mark it out. But I almost wonder if, a lot of the time, poetry is something you sing. I can picture him singing this. And I suppose the reason he says or sings this about this, the reason the reason this is the topic he speaks to his wives about, I suppose, is because this is something that increases his attractiveness. It proves how much he deserves their allegiance to him, their romantic attachment. If this was something that was sung, you can picture him coming home at the end of a day and bellowing out, Ada and Zillah, listen to my voice, while they kind of turn the corner with their eyes lighting up at the sound of their names. He goes on in the song and he basically says, I kill the one that crosses me. He sings that out as they come and kind of latch onto his arm and give him a kiss on the mouth or whatever. And, he goes on and he says basically, maybe God has a mark for Cain, but no one ever crosses me, which by implication is nobody ever crosses us. And, considering the fact that this is also the first significant figure in the Bible to have 2 wives, maybe that suggests as well that he is known for being more attractive, more powerful than most people, and his power is honed in his shameless and proud practice of not just retribution, but impulsive retribution, which increases his power and it increases the safety and security of his wives. So he begins singing, let's say, at least saying, but let's say this is something he begins singing as a memorable song to endear them to him all the more, reminding them how powerful he is, how secure they are, how attractive he is, and how much there is about him for them to be infatuated with. It's kind of like he's singing, we've got it made, you and me, except he's singing to 2 people instead of 1. And what he's singing about is premeditated murder that he's really proud of. So, it's kind of like he's saying, I don't need a mark from God on my forehead or wherever Cain's mark was. I don't need a mark. You cross me, I kill you. It's better than God's mark on my forehead. And it's also, if you notice, it's kind of in the passive. If Cain is to be avenged, so that's in the passive. A lot of the time in the Bible, people will avoid overusing the name of God or being irreverent or whatever. They'll speak in the passive, and it's understood that this is talking about God. But then when he finishes it, Lamech is to be avenged. It says, for Lamech it will be, but the implied structure of that grammatically would be Lamech is to be avenged. So he's putting it in kind of an implied passive, almost like it's in an implied divine passive, like he's putting himself in the place of God. I don't need a mark from God. I'm past Cain's level. It's almost like he's saying, maybe God watches out for Cain, but this God watches out for us. Now, since the Cain story was a subsection within the Adam and Eve and fall story, you could say the story's not over yet. We've done the second part here with the Cain story as a subsection, and then that culminates with the generations, and then it finishes with Lamech. But we could say, well, if this is the Adam and Eve and the fall story, we're not done yet. We've got a little bit more, verses 25 through 26. Adam knew his wife intimately again. So this is our third one. We've had 3 parallel statements here. Adam knew his wife, gave birth to in the beginning of the chapter here. And then Cain knew his wife, and we have the descendants of Cain. And now, the third one, verse 25, Adam knew his wife intimately again, and she gave birth to a son and named him Seth. For she said, God has given me another child in the place of Abel, since Cain killed him. A son was born to Seth also, and he named him Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of the Lord. This little bit here at the end is interesting with this people beginning to call on the name of the Lord. So I suppose we could say this is the original monotheism, the first practice of religion. What's kind of odd to think about is what happened in between. There's no mention here. Uh, God spoke to Cain very familiarly, very comfortably. I wonder if it became quiet after that. I wonder when it became quiet after that. At some point, it seems God made the transition from being near and familiar to the more hands off role. The text never says, and then God stepped back. Also interesting is that there's almost nothing told for between the origin of the religious worship of God in this verse here, between that and the religious, God forgotten, they forgot about God, society of Noah's day after the next genealogy. The next thing we get to is Noah, where people have entirely forgotten about God and they don't give a rip. Some fascinating gaps here in the story, some lacunas, we could say. I think that would be plural lacunae or lacunae. Anyway, some missing pieces that are just part of the package here. They were never there for us to know. But wouldn't it be fascinating? Wouldn't it be fascinating to see what happens? Anyway, so we're at the end here. This is the end of the chapter. Let's think about a couple of practical ways to plug in some more practical application aspects of this into our own lives. One thing that I find very interesting, there's two things I find interesting here, two sets of three things that I think we can see that's actually there in the text that's specifically relevant to us. So I think it's fascinating to think about how the course of sin has three levels in Genesis 3 through 4, each of them horrifically disastrous, and each of them something that we kind of see today as well. And also, the conversation between God and man also has three levels in Genesis 3 through 4, each of which is extremely important for all of humankind. So, now that we've finished going through the chapter, let's think about some of these interesting bits of takeaways here. So, first, let's think about these three different levels of sin in Genesis 3 through 4. The three levels of sin that we've got. We started off with number one, we've got hesitant sin, lured by good things, hoodwinked by lies that make the sin look wise. Remember the way it described Eve's reaction to the things that Satan said, or the things that the serpent said. Text doesn't say it's Satan, but we understand that to be the case based on Revelation and I think it's Hebrews. I forget, but anyway, the Christian perspective is that this is Satan. Anyway, remember, basically, she looked at it and realized, wow, this is the right thing to do. So, number one here is hesitant sin, lured by good things, hoodwinked by lies that make the sin look wise. Here's number one. Number two here is passionate sin, carried along in the heedless moment, pulled by cravings that are wicked and base, knowingly breaching what is good and right. Remember Cain, how he's full of hatred, anger, jealousy, and God told him that things inside of you are trying to take you. You've got to master them. But Cain, carried along in the moment, this is number two here, passionate sin, carried along in the heedless moment, pulled by cravings that are wicked and base, as you knowingly breach what is good and right. And we got number three. Number three, willful and culturally or habitually premeditated sins. Sins that one has concluded to be good and to be a way of life that you value and you love. Making room. You are making room to revel and rejoice in the practice of the wicked, base cravings, not with regret, but with delight. This is what's going on with Lamech. He comes home after a long day of work and he sings joyfully to his loving wives. about his sin that makes them, that they've got everything, they're set. Number one, hesitant sin, lured by good things, hoodwinked by lies that make sin look like wisdom. Number two, passionate sin, carried along in the heedless moment, pulled by cravings that are wicked and base. You're knowingly breaching what is good and right in the passion of the moment. Number three, it's willful. It's culturally or habitually premeditated. It's sin that you've concluded to be good and to be something you value and love, that you make room to revel and rejoice in. You revel and rejoice in the practice of these wicked, base cravings, like number two. Wicked, base cravings, but not with regret, not with being carried along out of control, but with value and loving it, but with the value of it, the love of it, with delight. And of course, the reason these are partly the reason these are so interesting to notice is because, of course, these are perennial. They're always around. And number two there, the passionate sin. Number two is a good illustration of evil desires that lie behind all sin. James 1, chapter 14, James chapter 1, verses 14 to 15, and I'll just look it up real quick so I don't misquote it. James 1 implies evil desires as being the source of sin. Verses 14 through 15. Each person is tempted when he's drawn away and enticed by his own desires. The HCSB says evil desires. Then after desire is conceived, it gives birth to sin. When sin is fully grown, it gives birth to death. So part of the reason the HCSB renders epithumia as evil desires is because, in context here, it has to be evil desires. Because when fully grown, it gives birth to death. So number two here, the sin of Cain, the passionate sin carried along in the heedless moment, feeding your wicked, base cravings. It's a good illustration of the evil desires because Cain's action springs out of some very specific evil desires. Number one is a good illustration of good desires that often lie behind sin as well. Number one, the sin of Eve, the hesitant sin, lured by good things, hoodwinked by lies that make the sin look wise. So number two is a good illustration of evil desires. Number one is a good illustration of good desires that often also lie behind sins that we do. We know there are good desires often behind sin because in James chapter 4, we see what is the source of wars and fights among you? Don't they come from the cravings that are at war within you? You desire and you don't have. You murder, you covet, and you can't obtain. You fight, you war. You don't have because you don't ask. So in James chapter 4, there's a desire that leads to sin. That's actually a good desire. And the reason you know it's a good desire is because he says you don't have because you don't ask. Why don't you ask God for the desire that you're murdering people over? So James 1 makes it pretty clear that at the root of sinful action is evil desire, that we inside us have evil desires that grow. If we feed them, the result is death. James 4 suggests that at least a lot of the time, there's this other parallel desire that's actually a good thing. And if we could only learn how to satisfy it the right way instead of satisfying it in a corrupt way. So number one gives us a good little window into the good desire. Number two here, the passionate sin, gives us a good little window into the evil desire because we can really see the evil desire. Number three here, the sin of Lamech, shows us what happens when the good desire within us and the evil desire within us have been equated and combined as one, because my way defines the order of things. For Lamech, the good desire that he wanted to find a way to satisfy in a healthy way was identical with the evil desire. They were the same thing to him. So succeeding in life meant what God would call evil. It's a little bit like in the book of Isaiah when it talks about calling evil good and good evil. Now, just to complete my parallelism here, I talked about how number one shows us good desire. Number one also has evil desire. Eve's desire to get something that's off limits, to get something now, to be great like God. And I pointed out how number two shows us evil desire. It also shows us good desire, the desire for the approval of God, the desire for good relationships where one person's not better than the other or something like that, etc. And number three as well has evil desires and good desires. Evil desire, I want to crush you because you got in my way. I want to be the king of this place. The good desire, I want there to be order. I want there to be I want people to not be coming after me in an offensive, angry way. I killed a man for hurting me. I don't want people to be hurting me. All right, so those are the three different interesting levels of sin that Genesis 3 through 4 illustrate. I mentioned there's also three levels of the conversation between God and man in Genesis 3 through 4. So we got number one here, God as familiar companion, the Father who's near and with whom we are at ease. That's the way things were with Adam and Eve. We could say this is the primeval formula. When there's no society, there's no people, so God's part of the family. And it also occurred in the culmination of times for a select few people. It occurred in the culmination of times for a select few people in that instance where God was made flesh in the life of Jesus. Similar thing happened. He's kind of like part of the family. He's one of the gang here. And it also occurs upon the culmination of times in the eschaton, when man and God will once again find familiar and mundane communion like members of the primeval garden household. Number two, in the 6 generations, and then also number one, to state the obvious, that includes the conversations with between God and Cain, which didn't seem to amount to a whole lot, unfortunately. Number two here, in these 6 generations of Cain's children, the mark of Cain is a memory. The recollections of Cain of God, the recollections Cain has of God, are kind of a scornful joke, perhaps, as God fades from view and Cain's children call it better. And as that happens, the progression of sin descends further and further. Without God, whom we so gladly dispose of, our darkness and misery compounds. We rejoice for the privation that will seal our misery the most. Number one, God is a familiar companion. Number two, in 6 generations of Cain's children, when it's fading and it's a memory that we laugh about scornfully. Then number three, at the very end here, reverent primal religion. The first practice of faith. In those days, they began to call on the name of the Lord. Eyes cast upward, memories recalling with hope memories recalled with hope and love. Pardon me, let me say that again. Eyes cast upward, memories recalled with hope and love, gifts and offerings extended to the Father of mankind, prayers and meditation and worship and thanksgiving to the giver and watcher of mankind. And we await his return. We await his great hope. This is before what happens in the book of Romans chapter 1. Everybody forgot God. One more time, we forgot God as a race, as civilization, failed to practice thankfulness, failed to practice praise. Instead of worshiping God, we turn aside to forget him, and before too long, we've got inside us the knowledge of the transcendent. Before too long, we're finding something to worship. The sun, the moon, the stars. Let's put together some gold, make an animal. That must be the great thing that is so much greater than us. But here we have, for a moment, some people at least, returning to God. May we, like the early seekers of God, may we look upward in worship to the one and only God. May we, in reverent worship, put to death the sins of every kind that are teeming inside our hearts, like in the heart of Cain, like in the heart of Eve, like in the heart of Lamech. May we, in reverent worship, put to death the sins of every kind that are teeming within our hearts, fueled by our evil desires, and often fueled by our good desires, coupled with the lie about how those good desires can be met and those needs satisfied the best. And may we seek the Lord, resting in the light of his hope and humbly receiving, like Abel, humbly receiving the approval of God's face. May we seek the Lord, and in the seeking find that his gaze is the answer to everything. And may we say, Amen.